Pokémon! How could you not feel happy and warm inside just by hearing the name? It is one of the most endearing and popular franchises in video game history. Recently, well, relatively recently, the brand became more popular than ever with the release of Pokémon Go, an application that seemed to represent what the whole saga of games were amounting to. Finally, you could actually go outside and capture Pokémon while exploring the world and meeting new people. And then everyone got tired of it after a while. In the past few months, the player base has reduced drastically, to the point that most people feel secure in stating that the community is dead, or that the game has run its course. Now, my dear viewer, you are probably asking yourself what does all of this got to do with the Pokémon generations, and specifically Generation 1. Well, everything, really. The term Gen 1er and the whole culture built around the first two games of the saga, Red and Blue, is really just a result of a big division inside the community. There are those who like Pokémon casually, and remember it as mostly just a really good part of their childhood. These are the guys that like Pokémon Go mostly as a trend, and then just quit after they got bored. Then there are those who are still fans of the games and the brand in general and take them fairly seriously. These are the ones that make up for most of the game's still pretty big player base, all things considered. There are of course gray areas between these two cases, but for the sake of simplicity, let's just stick with these. Now, most people think of Fan A as the real issue. They believe that Fan A is not a real fan, that they don't really like Pokémon, and because of this they are wrong and nostalgia bounded when they claim that the first generation is the best one. Now, while there is some truth in this, and there's no denying that there are some not really likable people among those who like the first generation, I still feel like the amount of hate these games receive is just uncalled for. And really, it all stems from this division between the fans. So I plead to all members of the respectful Fan B Club to please make an effort and try to join me in taking a look at the first games of Pokémon objectively, with no prejudices. So, if I wanted to talk about the things that are wrong with the first generation of Pokémon, I wouldn't need to look very far. Like, literally, a ton of people have helpfully compiled all of the flaws and mistakes of the game in convenient lists such as this one. So, let's see here. Leech Seed and Toxic would stack. Critical hits were based on speed. If you kill someone with Hyper Beam, you wouldn't need to recharge. Substitute could kill you if you didn't have enough health, and it wouldn't protect you from status effects. Speaking of which, most status effects just wouldn't work right. And many more. But hey, I'm not here to deny that the games were filled with mistakes, especially in the mechanic of moves and stats department. But I'm here to point out the many redeeming factors that these games still possess, even through all the flaws. So get ready for some title cards, because here we go! That joke was terrible. In my personal opinion, Kanto is one of the best designed regions in the franchise. And yes, while routes especially are kind of generic, I feel like the games did an excellent job balancing out all the different environments and introducing a lot of memorable locations. I mean, places like Lavender Town, or the lab at Cinnabar Island, or the Safari Zone are all quite memorable in everyone's minds. And they also knew how to give flair and make every one of these places interesting, even with the limitations of the time. Lavender Town, for example, has amazing music, we'll get back to that in a bit. But also the dialogue of many of the NPCs is downright disturbing, to the point that I think a creepypasta has been written about every single line of text spoken here. On the other hand, the Safari Zone was interesting because you could legitimately find some of the most awesome and powerful Pokémon in there. I mean, Scyther, Chansey, freaking Dragonair? Most fans thought that for generations we hadn't had a Safari Zone quite as good as this one. Cinnabar Lab with the diaries, Silph Co with the teleporters, most of the gyms, you name it. They knew how to make a place memorable and interesting by exploiting mechanics, dialogues, and the little details that made all of the difference. On the other hand, Kanto also knew how to balance out its environments, especially with the water. I mean, this game is definitely not getting a 7.8 from IGN because they knew what amount of the old H2O was enough. But by far, one of my favorite features of this region is how open-ended and original it is with its layout. To this day, I still think that putting the entrance to the lake right outside the first town is a genius choice, which ties up perfectly with the gameplay. The final destination of your journey is right there, in front of you,
and yet you cannot get in, because you have to get stronger, catch all the Pokemon you can and beat the gym leader. Only when you're experienced enough and when you have become a true Pokemon master will you be ready to turn back and face the ultimate challenge. It's so cool! Apart from that, I feel like the layout is good because it really does feel open. And the way they make you traverse the world is also pretty clever. At the beginning of the game, just to get from the first gym to the second gym, you have to traverse a pretty long route, and then the entirety of the Moon Cave while fighting rocket runs. But then gradually, more pathways open up to you. You find Diglett Cave and are able to go back to the first couple of routes. Then you give the guards something to drink and you open those paths up. Then you find Surf and become able to traverse on the sea, and so on. You really feel like slowly but surely you're getting the hang of the region itself, and are getting more and more efficient at going from one place to the other. Which, by the way, also cleverly ties up to the Lake King in the beginning. So, all in all, I feel like Kanto is definitely a good place for Pokemon adventuring. 10 out of 10, would travel again.
Now, I know this is probably one opinion that most people are going to disagree with, but I think that Team Rocket is one of the, if not the absolute best criminal organization in the series. What I believe to be great about them is the fact that they actually managed to be threatening and honest to God evil and dastardly in their plans. I mean, from the third generation onward, the villains in the series always tried to justify their actions with some philosophical mumbo jumbo that in most cases was not really deep and didn't really make a lot of sense. I mean, their evil plans go from creating more land and sea so that Pokemon are happy, to freezing the entire world for some reason, to killing everyone because, you know, why not? Their designs also get progressively silly as the saga goes on. I mean, just look at Team Flare. Like, come on you guys, your thing is supposed to be fashion. Finally, the dialogue spoken by most of the grunts feels more and more like just comic relief, making the entire group of bad guys who in the story is trying to destroy the world just seem like a joke. Team Rocket might be a bit generic, as many have pointed out, but at least they feel like a legit group of criminals who are committing evil acts for profit and power. I mean, just think about the times you encounter them in the games. First, you find them in Moon Cave, stealing fossils, and admittedly, this does feel kind of generic. But then, immediately after, you find that they have destroyed an innocent couple's house just to make their way out of Silurian City. Next time you find them, you discover that they have killed the mother of a now orphan Cubone, and taken over an entire graveyard just so that they could take an innocent old man as a hostage and torture some information out of him. Jeez, that escalated quickly. We went from robbery to vandalism to straight up murder real fast. And that's not it. They also conduct experiments on Mew to create the overpowered abomination that is Mewtwo, and took over the entirety of Silph Co. Now those are some really evil schemes, and there's no real connection between them. There's not a generic plan of world domination somehow tied to the legendaries of the region behind them stealing some fossils. They're just doing it because they want money. Their designs, while simple, at least take themselves seriously. I especially like the detail of the whip in the first generation sprites. There's another touch that shows how terrible they are. As one final example of how Team Rocket is more serious and believable than the villains in the other games, I would just like to make a comparison between the locations of their headquarters. In Pokemon Red and Blue, Team Rocket has a hidden base in the basement of a casino. Not only does the location feel accurate to where a real-life gang would conduct operations, but it's also great because it is an actual casino. If you go in without knowing that Team Rocket is there, you wouldn't suspect a thing, as everything seems normal. The people inside seem to know nothing, and you can actually play with the machines and even receive prizes. Instead, from the second generation onward, all of the secret bases of the villains are painfully pointed out to the player. Plus, most of said bases look really silly and completely over the top, once again taking all of the threat and suspense from the places supposed to be the lair of the bad guys. For all of these reasons, no matter how many leaf keys they drop, I still believe that the members of Team Rocket are the best villains of the series.
Gary Oak. What? You want me to elaborate on that? Well, alright, I guess. Gary is without a doubt the best and most iconic rival in the entire series. And what's great is that this is due to the simplest of reasons. Gary is a douche. The developers did a splendid job with the character of your rival in Red and Blue, as they mixed both story and gameplay elements to assure that everyone would hate his guts. First of all, he is always one step ahead of you. Every time you go into a gym, you get an unpleasant reminder that, indeed, Gary's already been there. Not only that, but the programmers purposely made it so that Gary would always show up in the least convenient of times, when your party is half dead and you have no items, to challenge you to battle. And I haven't even gotten into his freaking lines of dialogue yet. Always taunting you, never accepting defeat even after the 100th time you beat him. Gosh, I hate this guy! But that's great, because through the entire game, Gary does his job wonderfully. He is a rival in the true sense of the word. Someone who's going on the same journey as you, even if following different paths. Someone who you are constantly competing with, and someone that inspires you to be better. And everyone wanted to be better than Gary, just so that they could get one on him, so that they could shut his bratty mouth and show him that you have to show love and kindness to Pokemon. Speaking of which, his character is interesting, and one we don't see very often in video games or stories in general. He is mean, but he's not the villain. He mistreats his Pokemon, but not because he's evil. He's just someone who craves to be the best and does what he thinks is necessary to achieve that goal. In the end, he understands where he was wrong and evolves, but never abandons the cockiness and arrogance that made him who he is. Such complexity in the face of a simple children's game story is a weird sight, but one that I very much enjoy. Something that makes me sad is that after the second generation, which had another great rival in Silver, the Pokemon games just gave up on this kind of character and story arc. It seems they were too shy to include a mean rival, so instead all the rivals began to be friendlier and friendlier, to the point that there was not even any competition between you. Heck, some rivals such as Hugh, Bianca, and most of the guys in X and Y didn't even want to challenge the league. Having different goals and journeys, it's kind of hard to establish any kind of rivalry with these characters, and it would be okay if they were at least interesting, but most of the times their arcs are generic and dull, and they just end up being kind of meh. I would love to see a comeback of the douchey rival character type, but for now I believe that Gary is the guy I'll stick with when I want a rival on my journey. Just listen. Gen 1's music is incredibly good, almost too good. Composer Junichi Masuda took a bunch of pixelated noises and managed to create something truly special with them. Every theme in this game is at least somehow memorable, and they all transmit exactly the feeling they're supposed to. From happy, to adventurous, to scary. It speaks volumes when a single song from this game has spawned more creepypastas than entire sagas of horror games. For all of these reasons and more, I tip my hat to Generation 1 and its almost flawless soundtrack. Pokemon Red and Blue are just great games. There's really nothing else to say.
Their graphics, characters, music, and gameplay are all amazing. I mean, if we go back to the list of flaws, it's obvious that the games has several imperfections, and that's just natural. They were the first of their kind. But even then, the gameplay was still pretty solid, and most of the mistakes listed up here and elsewhere only occurred in very specific situations and scenarios. And even if the special stat was terrible and psychic Pokemon were horrendously overpowered, it was still a fun game and you still felt like you could use all the Pokemon. And before anyone complains about how unbalanced Mewtwo and others were, then allow me to remind you that Pokemon's PvP has always been horrendously balanced. I mean, Mega Evolutions. Enough said. At the end of the day, I can't help but be amazed that these games, the one that introduced the concepts and gameplay destined to be popular for decades to come, still hold up so well after all these years. And so, without a shred of nostalgia in my voice or mine, I can proudly state that the first generation of Pokemon is better than what most people think.